Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. I'm Yulia Joja with the Middle East Institute, a director of the Black Sea Program. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Black Sea Security, Romania's military modernization and Armenia's foreign policy reorientation. Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine has pushed the Black Sea region to the forefront of international attention and forced regional countries to overhaul their own security calculations. The countries of the extended Black Sea region are now undergoing some of the most profound shifts in their foreign and security policy, as well as in their defense policy, with Romania and Armenia both being at the forefront of some of these changes. Notably, when we're looking at Romania, the United States' perhaps most staunchest ally in the region, Bucharest has increased its defense spending, has pushed ahead with major defense acquisitions, primarily from the United States, and it is building strategic partnerships with Washington, its main strategic ally, but also with allies and partners in the region, as well as looking at strengthening its military industrial complex due to the pressure of the war in Ukraine. If we're looking on the other end at Armenia, the situation is a lot more complicated, given that Armenia has been a long-standing ally of Russia, but the government is orchestrating now a complete foreign policy reorientation, or rather overhaul, and a reorientation that is towards the West. But to achieve this, Yerevan has to overcome deeply ingrained strategic dependencies on Russia and other actors in the region, and overcome regional as well as overall isolation, both of which represent significant challenges to Yerevan's foreign policy in the months and years ahead. This panel discussion brings together two of this year's Black Sea Program Title VIII research fellows to present their findings on the strategic challenges and opportunities that both Armenia and Romania are facing in the context of Russia's aggression in the Black Sea region and war against Ukraine. The fellowships are granted by the United States Department for the Middle East Institute's Black Sea Program. And today, as I mentioned, I'm joined by two of our fellows, Sarkis Karabashian with Georgetown University, freshly graduate, and Harry Halem with LSE in a PhD program there, who's visiting us from London today. I'm looking forward to taking audience questions that you can address to us in the Zoom's Q&A feature that you can see on your screen. For those of us calling in by phone or watching us on the live stream on YouTube, you can ask questions by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us @mei. If you have any technical issues, please email same address, events@mei.edu. And please feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for all of your questions and doing my best to factor as many in as possible into the conversation. But to get things kicked off, I have a couple of questions for our panelists, and we'll switch between Armenia and Romania because we are in the Black Sea region. And perhaps we can start with the broader question to Sarkis on Armenia. Sarkis, you went to Armenia to look at how, to what extent, and what the dimensions are of Armenia's foreign policy reorientation, which to us in Washington, D.C. is somewhat of a new thing, somewhat of a topic that is underexplored and that we're trying to watch, as well as trying to do our best to support. So if you're looking at this process of the government in Yerevan's reorientation, before we get into the challenges, what's your assessment, your initial assessment? It's been going on for a couple of years now, and I alluded to the fact that there's a bunch of hurdles and a bunch of strategic dependencies. So before we go into challenges and questions about the reversibility of this process, How do you assess it?
Hmm. Are you talking about in process or like an overall assessment?
Overall assessment
Yeah.
and maybe a little bit of the process.
I would say that there overall that Armenia is making a tangible shift towards the West, but there are limitations to this that we'll get into. But this is based off indicators, both sentimental and tangible, that were uncovered during the interviews that I conducted during my research.
So who did you talk to and what did they say?
Yeah, so I talked to a mixture. So there's 41 different interviews, about an hour and a half each long, that I conducted with government officials from the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Ministry, the Judicial Branch, with the Minister of Economy and Ministry of Economy, and also experts who advise this community as well, and then also representatives from the private sector, specifically within the tech and logistics sector.
And if you're looking throughout these domains, from judiciary to foreign policy to particularly the sensitive topics of security and defense, where would you say lie the biggest concrete challenges that the administration is facing in Yerevan when it comes to attempting to decouple? That's not necessarily the language that they're using, but diversify, right, is the language that they're using. Diversify from a single strategic dependence.
So I would say that the biggest ways I would say, decoupled, to quote Narcissus Kopalian, the biggest way that you can see Armenia decoupling in terms of its security alliances and security infrastructure is through Armenia's freezing of CSTO relations, and then also through the removal of border guards from the Zvartsansk airport, as well as an expressed desire during multiple interviews to remove them from Armenia's borders to replace them with Armenian border guards. But I would say the biggest outlying factor to sustain this trajectory successfully is economic. Everything points back to Armenia's ability to grow its economy, as well as access ports and diminish the reliance it has on Russia for its economy, because over 50% of its economy relies on Russian trade and exports.
Yeah, it seems to be that this is maybe one of the threads that we can pull in commonality from Armenia all the way to Romania, that when we're looking at security, the reality is that we cannot create it without focus on economy. And this interplay is one that governments across the region and not only have a challenge in balancing. And that's my attempted segue to focus a little bit on Romania and ask you a similar question. Maybe you want to point to the economic aspects of it, but when we're looking at Romania, to create a little bit of context, Romania is in a very different position when it comes to the foreign policy orientation. Unlike Armenia, it has been in NATO, in the EU, staunch member and supporter of Western security for a long time. But it has been forced by circumstances, as so many other countries in the region, to up its defense capacities and capabilities in light of the war. And we have, on the one hand, political promises, bipartisan ones for years now, in Romania to up defense spending and to increase basically Romania's defense capabilities. So first big question then, broad question is, you've just returned from traveling extensively, not just to Bucharest, but also across Romania with some very interesting visits at sites. What's your take on this, if we can call it military modernization process? Where are we now, 2024, 2.5 years into the full-scale invasion? How do you assess Romania's readiness, essentially?
That's, I think, a very reasonable place to start when we consider Bucharest's location and a broader alliance constellation on the eastern flank. For one, it seems that Romanian policymakers, the Romanian intelligentsia, and slowly, but I do think at this point, surely the Romanian population has understood that the possibility of full-scale war on the eastern flank of NATO is live. and that Romania is going to be a central area of contestation, a central staging ground, and a key military member of NATO in that fight. That's true regardless of the result of the Ukraine war, although that conflict's trajectory will clearly impact different contingency pathways. That being said, the difficulty in Romania at this point is modifying a procurement philosophy that has been very diplomatically focused since realistically the end of the Cold War and the transition from communism to one that actually seeks to build combat power. Put very briefly, Romania, since it joined NATO and since it joined the European family, has viewed military procurement primarily as a political lever to ensure that its larger, wealthier, more capable partners are going to show up if something bad happens, whether that is a larger war with Russia or some kind of hybrid crisis akin to the beginning of the Ukraine war in 2014, a theorized crisis against the Baltics, etc. This has a good deal of sense in it. Romania's budgets are constrained. Romania has a number of different domestic issues it needs to unpack. It's attempting to transform its economy and finally does seem to be at a takeoff point. The trouble is, by exclusively buying big ticket Western items, Romania saps its ability to construct a force rationally and thereby undermines its actual generation of combat power. There are ways to address this while still engaging very robustly with the Western defense industrial complex, and that's likely Romania's most prudent path. But some of this transition is going to have to involve uncomfortable conversations, not just within the government, but at least from my understanding of things from my time on the ground, between the government and civil society and those critical industrial actors and intellectuals who are also shaping policy. They need to ensure that Bucharest understands it should have some sort of independent defense capacity and some sort of ability to stand on its own and manufacture the military equipment it needs, perhaps in partnership with the West, perhaps partly independently, but regardless, independence is necessary for this whole system to work.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. You've been witness as looking into Romania and traveling to through Romania about the conversations that we've had over there prior to 2022 and after about offset, right? Romania's priority to have more offset, to get more bang for its buck and knowledge for its buck, that seems to have been put in the background in the context of the urgency of 2022. Oops, what do? We need these ample, expensive defense capabilities that we're just not ready to produce or haven't been ready to produce. So then what is the current debate and what's your stance, I guess, on the capacity of planning towards offsets for Romania? I think that's relevant for other countries in the region, and Romania has been attempting to lead a little bit on this in Southeastern Europe, but is maybe not there yet. I'm curious to hear what you think about that. And then the second thing is, you've also looked in your research particularly at the connection between Romania and Ukraine in the context of the war. We do not know too much about military aid from the Romanian side to Ukraine, but we know overall that they've been forced and wanting to cooperate more intensely militarily. And Ukraine, with all its constraints and all the heavy pressure coming from the war, has been able, despite or against all odds, to build limited in local defense industry, right? That they have been able to use here and there where there have been limits from the Western side in terms of aid. So are there lessons learned from Ukraine that you feel the Romanian establishment has been starting to talk about, incorporate, and where do you see the potential for more regional cooperation, as well as you alluded to kind of intra-Western cooperation when it comes to Romania building more of its own capacity?
So on the first question about offset, I'd actually invert the way that you've characterized the narrative. From my experience, prior to 2022, the Romanian political establishment was comfortable with basically avoiding major discussions around offset agreements. For our audience members who might not know the technical terminology behind defense deals, offset involves some sort of compensation to a buyer country when they purchase some kind of military equipment from abroad. Typically, this is governed by a number of local regulations about how much money you have to put down, what kind of industries you have to put it in. The gold standard of offset, for example, Poland's case, involves the buyer country actually taking over production capacity. Poland, in this case, is going to be producing F-16s at some point in the next 10-ish years in a very comprehensive offset agreement with Lockheed. That's essentially the gold standard throughout the region. Romania has had offset laws on its books in one way or another since the early 2000s. This is obviously necessary for a country like Romania, where the defense industry was, despite its contraction, so unbelievably central to Romanian political economy up until the fall of communism, and remained relevant afterwards, given its industrial implications. The trouble is, prior to the Ukraine war, because the Romanian policy establishment viewed major defense article purchases as a diplomatic political lever, the offset framework did not include government-to-government contracts. Most of the time, when a foreign country purchases US military equipment, it will be run through a government-led foreign military sales process. The point behind this process from the American side and from the purchaser side is completely reasonable. It mitigates the risk to the purchasing country. It ensures that the US government can manage the deal and cut back different elements of red tape, ensure that it's interfacing directly with the supplier, whether that's Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, whoever you're buying from. The problem is, without an offset framework around government-to-government contracts, big ticket items aren't recouped in the Romanian defense industry or in the domestic economy. That started to change in the last year with revised offset legislation. Now you do have mandates for offset under government-to-government contracts. The difficulty is, of course, it's not quite clear how these offset obligations are meant to be fulfilled. There's a new agency that runs this process in Romania. Its makeup is extraordinarily complex, and the benchmarks it uses to identify either financing or some kind of tangible result aren't quite clear yet because of how new it is. That being said, over the next 5 years, if Romania can maintain this momentum, and depending on who future defense ministers are, depending on the relationship between the economy and the defense ministry, because the economy ministry runs the Romanian defense industry, and in particular, depending on who runs Arctis, the offset board, you could seriously see Romania managing financial inflows effectively. It would likely and should ideally require a United States that understands the situation and understands that independent Romanian strategic capacity is overwhelmingly in American interest. It's a useful bridge point to your second question on Ukraine and its defense industry. It's not simply the Ukrainian example that stands out for Romania, it's also other neighbors in the region. In 1989, Romania was one of the largest defense producers in the world. It had a vibrant small arms industry. It also produced pretty much everything from assault rifles to light attack aircraft and some lower tier fighter jets. It was a one-stop shop for basically any sort of defense article you'd want, aside from extraordinarily advanced stuff. That's contracted rather aggressively since the end of the Cold War because there's not as much money to go around and because the industry was state supported. No communism, no cash. The distinction between the Romanian case and a number of its neighbors is that while Romania retains its state-owned structure, it hasn't marketized it effectively. Poland, for example, has aggressively marketized its state-owned arms conglomerate. That allows Poland to, per what we said previously, engage in an F-16 production contract. Czechia, or formerly Czechoslovakia, has spun off a number of its former state-owned firms into private conglomerates that still interface effectively with the government. Even Serbia has identified market niches, particularly powder production, that allow it to remain competitive, especially now that powder demand is booming. Ukraine's case is particularly illustrated for Romania because the Ukrainian defense industry, much like Romania's, was state-run for a very long time, but the pressures of war and uniquely talented leadership in the Strategic Industries Ministry, which has now been moved up to the president's office, to my understanding, has forced Ukraine to marketize aggressively, cut back red tape, and overhaul the bureaucracy. That kind of push could absolutely exist in Romanian industry. It would simply take political willpower, likely from the president's office, and some help along the way from the United States.
Yeah, at this point, if there's any uniforms from Romania watching, I know they're cheering at what you're saying, but I want to ask both of you two questions regarding the United States, and then I'll turn to our questions from the audience because we're getting, or you are getting, some amazing ones, and I want to give as much space to that as possible. So I'll start with you, Harry, so that we can transition to Armenia, where you have already, Sarkis, a bunch of questions. So for Romania and the United States, the question, I guess, is why should the United States further invest into the relationship with Romania, focusing particularly on the military? There's a big conversation in Romania about the strategic partnership with the United States and that there hasn't been enough economic focus overall. But that's not the topic, and it's not the only country in the region that complains about that. But that's not the topic of our conversation. I'm just looking at the military side. Why should the United States, beyond the fact that Romania is buying big ticket items almost exclusively from the US, which furthers the understanding in Romania that there's an additional potential security guarantee, why should the United States, on the other hand, invest more into Romania as linchpin, as unsinkable aircraft carrier, whatever you want to call it in the region?
I was actually told off for using the term linchpin on one of my first days in Bucharest. But after spending time there via the fellowship, I understand why. It's not quite the right way to understand the relationship between Washington and Bucharest. Instead, the United States needs to start not specifically with strategy and operations, but with politics and industry. Romania has been acclimated to the European system, which, for all of its aggravating aspects, for all of its glacial pace, has developed ways to lock in policy preferences over time through multiple levels of discussion and mediation. It has its issues, but that is an enormous leverage point, particularly for long-term policymaking vis-a-vis Russia, China, the Middle East, and for defense expenditure and acquisition. As I'm sure a number of audience members are familiar with in their day-to-day work, the European powers, and more specifically the European Union, wants member countries to purchase domestic European military items in increasing quantities over the next 10 years. The idea being that over time, this will develop a legitimate European strategic and defense industrial autonomy. From the American perspective, this has obvious benefits. Our allies acting more capably is effective for us, but it needs to be managed properly because the United States defense industry interfaces so thoroughly with those of its European counterparts that if we don't maintain this cooperation, both of us will lose technologically and potentially be outpaced by our adversaries. Romania offers an excellent way to maintain an understanding of the European market structure while also accelerating domestic European defense modernization and defense industrial expansion. The US gets a front row seat into the way this process is going to work by actually putting cash down for Romanian systems. From there, we can turn to operational and strategic questions in military terms, which also, of course, matter alongside the policy ones. Strategically speaking, Romania is going to be at the center of any major conflict on the eastern flank, and in particular, it's going to be the center of any major conflict on the southeastern flank of NATO. That's Russia's game. The Baltics, for all of the attention we've paid to it over the past 10 years since Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, are not the same kind of target. They're not as porous, they're not as fragmented. The Russians cannot leverage the sorts of capabilities that they can in the Baltics versus the Baltic states as they can against Romania, Bulgaria, and are doing against Ukraine today. That makes Romania a central bulwark for the rest of the region when placed alongside Poland and ideally a Ukraine that's integrated into American-led defense structures. Operationally speaking, if the United States is going to fight on the eastern flank, it needs forward-positioned materiel in Romania, and it needs to be able to conduct maintenance and repair in Romania. That requires some sort of transfer of technical capacity. Whether we want to do it through a full offset agreement or otherwise, that's a question for political economy that's a little bit more complicated, but there needs to be capacity in Romania to reservice and refurbish damaged American and NATO equipment. Without that, the United States is not going to be able to fulfill its alliance commitments and not going to be able to fight for very long.
That's pretty clear guidelines. Thank you for that. And then turning to Sarkis, I know very broad question, but nevertheless, why does the United States need Armenia?
Yeah, this is a question that I think I and every Armenian diasporan who advocates for Armenia has been trying to diagnose and assess and communicate. From my research,
So no pressure,
No,
but
I've been trying to think outside of the box as much as possible with this one. And so I want to direct attention towards the strategic, the announcement of, or the joint statement between the United States and Armenia on working towards a strategic partnership that was made on June 11th of this year. And the strategic partnership, the things that are being worked on towards this are regarding economy, energy, military, law enforcement, security cooperation, as well as strengthening Armenia's judiciary. But the goal of this, I've thought very deeply, what can the U.S. Benefit from its relationship with Armenia? And there's a few ways. So in terms of tangibles, the tech sector, partnering in the AI race, Armenia has an incredible amount of intellectual capability. And you have companies like Intel, NVIDIA, and Synopsys working there with offices, despite Armenia being on a Class D export list and having limitations to the types of technology it has access to. These companies have chosen to do business in Armenia because they see it as a safe and secure environment to further their technological advances. And then also for critical mining, Armenia has most of Armenia's geological surveys are dated from the 80s. It's quite a long time. They're from the Soviet era. And there is cobalt in Armenia, there's molybdenum, there's copper. These are critical minerals. And this is an opportunity that I think if the United States doesn't take to seize hold of, someone else will. And someone who was already doing that is China in the region. So right now, Armenia is the only country in the region that does not have a strategic cooperation agreement or strategic partnership agreement with China. Azerbaijan and Georgia do. And so if the United States cares about this region and who influences it, and if they care about countering Chinese influence in the region especially, I would say putting all your chips into Armenia is the best bet, considering what's already happened with the other two neighbors. And I do believe and have a strong conviction that increased Western presence, and I'm hinting at the French, the EU, more broadly, and the United States, I have a strong conviction that a larger presence and investment from these countries into Armenia will also help bring countries like Georgia back to the table with the EU and enhance and solidify and reinforce interactions between Georgia and the Western world. But yeah, those are the strong convictions I have in terms of what value Armenia brings. But there's also other things. I think Armenia can be a great place, a great staging ground for diplomatic activity, because inevitably the regimes in Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan, and in Russia will change. And we don't know the results of these changes, but when they do, there's going to be a need for a place for representatives of these countries to come that's stable, that's peaceful, and beautiful and fun to go to, where Western representatives or representatives from any country can come to Armenia and have conversations in a neutral zone. And I think Armenia is an incredible place to do that.
I agree. And I think if I can add anything to that, there's also the democracy aspect with excessive pressure from Russia and not only authoritarian regimes. China, you mentioned Iran is next door. We also have the obligation to not just support at a declarative level, but with resources, democracy and democracy consolidation in the region. So two questions for you, Sarkis, from the Armenian side.
Oh, man.
Two aspects, but focused on organizations, and one of them at least is anticipating something that I wanted to ask. So thank you for that. First one is, and I'll couple them. First one is from Aram Avetisian. Thank you for your question. What is the perspective, or what is the Armenian perspective in the Collective Security Organization, CSTO? Why does Yerevan remain a member of the organization? Or I would add to it, what is the status now?
Yeah. So the status is frozen. They're not participating in any meetings, exercises. They're not contributing financially. The Armenian government's done everything it can to express to the West and to anyone outside of the CSTO that it is no longer no longer a part of this agreement. And in a meeting with the foreign ministry, revealed this very directly, where they said, we don't plan to reverse course on this because the CSTO proved to be utterly useless. This is the quote. And you saw this example in 2021, 2022, and even with the current 200 kilometers of territory that Azerbaijani troops are on as we speak in Armenia. And so that's a core reason, because the CSTO's Article 4 is supposed to be guaranteeing Armenia's security from threats to its sovereignty, but this proved to be utterly useless, their quote. So that's one reason. Now, the reason that Armenia is not fully out of it yet is due to a number of factors, but a meeting with an insider of Armenia's national security community revealed to me that there are layers to the agreement itself. There's not a mechanism for Armenia to just up and leave. It can declare this, of course, any country can do that, but from my understanding, and I could be wrong, other countries have to agree. So it depends on essentially Russia to allow. It's like, you leave when I say you can leave type situation. But again, Armenia could declare itself no longer a part of it. And they have essentially, for all intents and purposes, done that.
So then the next one is related to the EU,
Yeah.
not strictly related to the United States, but has implications for the US and how we're seeing this space too. And that is, what are the perspectives of EU-Armenia visa-free dialogue? And if that would be obtained, how much of a difference would that make for Armenia?
Yeah. I would say more negative than positive, and here's why. It would enable more opportunities for its people to pursue education in Europe, to pursue work in Europe. And this is a good thing on the individual level. On the macro level, the state level, what a lot of people that I interviewed within the government and the expert community assessed, at least their initial impression of increasing ties with the EU in this way, will amplify the brain drain of the country. Anybody who looks at Armenia for a few minutes will realize that its population has been decreasing, and that, and along with that, anybody who is well-educated, well-skilled usually leaves Armenia. You're seeing a little bit of a decrease in this trend now, but there is that fear that enhancing the EU visa liberalization ties between Armenia and the EU will cause this. And then on the broader trade aspect with the EU, Armenia right now, from a meeting with Tigran Gerbashian, who's a renowned economist with Emiria Bank in Armenia, he explained to me how the economy of the EU is so large that Armenia right now is not in any place with its legal framework to become a part of that in a way that wouldn't impact negatively Armenia's economy. So if that's going to happen, a lot needs to change in regulatory measures and infrastructure in that aspect, but then also access to ports. The ports of Boti and Batumi are currently the only two ports that service Armenia that are closest. But if Armenia were to somehow, let's say, gain access to a Mediterranean port in Turkey, then that would reduce a whole number of logistical factors and the price, therefore, with direct access to Europe. So these things could make it possible, but a lot of Armenians understand that the EU trajectory may sound nice, but there's a lot of tangible factors that must be considered.
That's a very thoughtful answer and something for Yerevan and Brussels to think about carefully, especially when we have lessons learned from very complicated ones from Georgia next door, right? One question, next question then is to Harry to change things up from Tamara Behrens. Hi, Tamara. What should the State Department's role be in encouraging US investment in the Romanian defense industrial sector and in the region more broadly?
Thanks, Tamara. This question is a difficult one to cut, of course, because state isn't the only one who's responsible for these sorts of issues. It's also the Department of Defense, and this does intersect with Treasury. Why does this matter? Principally because the greatest issue in the Romanian defense industry, and I also do believe if you look across the region, particularly in Ukraine, also to a degree in Poland, is a lack of private capital. It's extraordinarily difficult for private ventures, which are in the end going to be the most productive and the most innovative throughout the space, to secure capital that they need to actually start expanding production capacity beyond specific, relatively sophisticated systems, talking optics, certain pieces of software, things that plug into larger items. Why can't they actually acquire capital? Because on the one side, European banking regulations throughout the EU and including in Romania make it nearly impossible for anyone working in the defense sector to get a standard loan. I've heard multiple stories about bank accounts even being in jeopardy once an individual has begun working in the defense sector. It's still classified as a vice item for basically irrational reasons. This is an important capacity, it should not be, but one should never rely on Brussels to change any kind of law or regulation quickly. On the other side, there is growing interest in private defense investment from the sorts of capital-rich actors that you see in the US and parts of Europe. The trouble is they don't look that far east. Part of that is a lack of market knowledge and a lack of sector knowledge. Part of that is a perception of heightened risk. This didn't just apply to the defense sector, this applied to broader investment in Romania. After February 2022, there was the view that some magic line almost that started somewhere to the east of Croatia made it very high risk to put any money down in the Western Black Sea, either in Romania or in Bulgaria, which undermined the regional economy and still has deleterious implications. How can DOS and DoD fix this? Part of it is probably more aggressively working with the commercial office in the US Embassy in Bucharest and encouraging Americans to actually travel to the region and build a regional network of those who could accept private capital and quickly operationalize it. Part of it is a more concerted focus on the Pentagon side and in Foggy Bottom on actually implementing offset agreements. This can be difficult because you're talking about very much understanding a foreign legal system and a foreign political system. But if you can foresee how your interlocutor is going to be arguing for financial apportionment after a major contract, you can begin to build leverage and direct that money to places that you think is more productive. Of course, this requires a large amount of coordination between, and likely will generate some friction between the United States and Romania. A productive and healthy relationship should have friction points. The question is, can we establish a dialogue that's transparent enough to overcome them?
All right, so then another follow-up question, or not follow-up question, but within the same realm on Romania for you, Harry, from George Bishan, hi George, is regarding the development of Romania's naval capabilities. What trends have you identified? You and I and George and many others know that the naval part of the Romanian military is perhaps the most sensitive one.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of hope and a lot of frustration in there and hope for progress. So now, after the summer and after your research in the region, what's your assessment? And let me phrase it with, what is the outlook? What are your hopes for the coming year?
The naval question is, of course, the most difficult in Romanian defense procurement. Briefly, to discuss the history of it, Romania has gone through multiple iterations of both modernization and acquisition for different big ticket naval items, all of which have at minimum been delayed over budget and at worst just haven't actually materialized the systems that can be put in the water. Why has this happened? In part, it's no one's hands are clean. Everyone makes mistakes in the defense acquisition process. Bucharest is no exception. Decisions to move back and forth between foreign suppliers. Part of it was undeniably, however, competition between those foreign suppliers themselves, particularly the Europeans. A number of different European contractors essentially kept attempting to snatch deals from each other, which, because Bucharest didn't have the leverage to push back over time, led to the acquisition process spinning out of control. What do I hope will happen in the next year? Realistically, in the next 5 years? At least in the next year, actually having a coherent redraft of program requirements would be helpful. And why do I say redraft? Because if Romania can leverage its domestic shipbuilding and ship repair industry, which still does exist, Romania is host to a number of very reasonably sized regional shipyards, some of which are leading in the tonnage that they can produce and maintain, a number of which can produce military hulls if you have the right equipment in the yard and the right expertise, then one could rather quickly actually build out a fleet. Ukraine provides an interesting model with its repurposed, partly autonomous or at least remote controlled naval explosives packed naval drones. Romania could combine that system with a number of small surface combatants and unmanned aviation to create a reasonable detection network that at minimum imposes cost on any Russian infringements on Romanian sovereignty and can monitor the lucrative offshore energy deposits and in the future likely wind deposits that the Romanian economy is going to care about a lot. Do I think that this process is going to get going in the next year? I'm not sure, simply because naturally Romania is in an election year, and the new government's going to have a lot on its plate. It very much depends on whether or not the new president is capable of working effectively with the defense and economy ministries. Personality is going to be everything in this game. Fortunately, those who seem likely to win have an understanding of not technical defense requirements, but the importance of an authentic and independent Romanian military. So there's a dialogue that can absolutely be had around February to May next year between Washington and Bucharest.
All right. So then we have a few more minutes, and I want to do the following. We're getting some fantastic questions from our audience. Thank you so much. I'm doing my best to get in as many as possible. I have one quick question related to the military side to wrap that up for Sarkis in terms of acquisitions, and then one question that is for both of you in terms of the commonalities of Armenia and Romania when we're looking at Russia and challenges. But before we get to the last question, I want to ask, and this is a question from Donald Wilson Bush. So far in the past 6 months, Armenia has made 2 minor arms purchases from India and France, respectively. Why has Romania not made any major arms purchases from any of the top 5 US-based prime military industrial contractors? And is it likely that Armenia will be making such a purchase from American prime contractors in the near future?
I'm going to answer this question in reverse order. So the likelihood is low right now, and the reason that Armenia hasn't been able to purchase U.S. weapons is because it's not allowed to. There's something called ITAR restrictions, which you can research online. But the purchases that Armenia has made thus far from India as well as France are not minor. The media reports about 600 million. It's much more than that from the interviews that I had, much, much more. And these purchases for weapons are substantial. They're way more complex systems. They're systems that can tangibly help Armenia counter the drone threat that was witnessed during the 2020 war between the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. And so this threat has been recognized, and there's movement towards addressing that threat. And not only are these substantial purchases from France and India, but they're addressing the threat, but they also come with their own set of advisors, maintenance schedules, and commitments this is a diplomatic activity at the end of the day of some form that strengthens the relationship between France and India, which are two historical, very, very historical countries for Armenia in many, many ways. And then I want to also address the domestic arms industry within Armenia. Has been developing very quietly, but very effectively. And the Ministry of High Technology announced this year that they're devoting 500 million USD towards the development of this industry. But there are some major problems that exist with this. It's easier right now to procure from externally from Armenia than it is internally. There's a lot of restrictions that make it very difficult for a local company in Armenia to develop arms. There's a lot of oversight. There's a lot of bureaucracy where companies have to hire more staff just to deal with the paperwork. And this all came from an interview with a representative from the domestic arms industry community in Armenia. But and then also the relationship between the Ministry of Defense and the arms industry in Armenia is still developing. And when I say still developing, I mean that there's not a lot of efficient interaction between the representatives of these agencies and organizations to facilitate more directed development of weapon systems that'll address Armenia's needs, and also at a cost that is reasonable and feasible. Because it's always easier to produce in-house, or it's always more efficient and cheaper to produce in-house than it is to go buy from France and India. But I think this combination of things shows a very good trajectory for Armenia's security, and that Armenia's leaders recognize the threat, they're trying to work towards it. And this is something that is a substantial and objective good for Armenia, because the biggest problem right now is addressing the arms disparity between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And you don't have to Google very long to understand this disparity, but it's huge.
All right. So just a quick note for those questions that we haven't been able to answer yet on Armenia and Azerbaijan, particularly Asli Aydin Tabash's question. If you want to hold that for the next panel and others too, we will continue in 10 minutes with the second panel on Armenia and Azerbaijan. So thank you for that, our colleague from Brookings, and the others too. On Romania, you can readdress them to Harry offline. But just to wrap it up, if you can give me an answer, each one of you in a minute or less, on what are the common challenges and differences in your understanding between Armenia and Romania in the context of relations with Russia. Where is the Russia problem in the two? And maybe we could start with you, Sarkis, and wrap up with Harry.
So to be concise as possible, what the complication I see between Russia and Armenia is that for a very, very long time, Russia and Armenia were very, very close allies. There was no change in the status quo until realistically 2020 and forward, but very much so in 2022. Once that status quo has changed, now you're seeing the rifts and the effects of this relationship being altered. And Russia does not like this. They've made it very clear through their talking heads in their media, as well as through Azerbaijan, and that's a whole other can of worms. But they've made it very clear that they do not want Armenia to go anywhere near the West, towards the West at all, or even just to decouple themselves from Russia. And so in relating that with Romania, what I do see the common challenges is for a country that's young in its independence, understanding what it means to rule itself and to govern itself and to develop itself, because there's so much reliance on the Soviet system for so long. This is something that's been a process, and what that process requires is stability. And Armenia hasn't had many years of stability. They've had horrible earthquake in Spitak, and they've had two major wars. They've had political changes. And so right now, there's only been a few years of real stability that's enabled this type of development and growth. So to be concise for time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Harry, over to you. What's the deal between Russia and Romania?
The critical similarity per the terms of the question on Romania and Armenia vis-a-vis Russia is February 2022 woke both countries up. And both realized in their own ways that their relationships with Russia, one very different than the other, of course, for completely understandable political reasons, in both contexts, that relationship was no longer viable. On the Romanian side, the key question moving forward is Russia's a threat, undeniably. Russia's a direct military threat, undeniably. What is Romania meant to do about that? How does it fit into NATO? How does it fit into the European Union? And crucially, and this is talked about quietly, will be talked about more, if I had to guess, over the next 6 months, particularly after November in the United States, what relationship should Romania have with Ukraine? And what relationship should the other Eastern flank countries have with Ukraine? On Armenia's side, of course, as Sarkis has laid out, Armenia is trying to reorient itself very carefully, dealing with a constellation of factors that are largely beyond its control. The key similarity between Romania and Armenia in that regard is institutional inertia and political inertia. Both are trying to think in authentically new ways about their foreign and security policies at a time where the pressures towards action are immense and the costs of both inaction and mistakes are extraordinarily high. Romania, fortunately, benefits from its NATO membership, but fortunately for Romania's purposes at least, Romanian elites have realized that Article 5 is not a magic barrier against subversion. Romanians want to remain independent, much like the rest of Europe. They're going to have to fight for it.
All right, that's two sound conclusions on this. For our audience that has been tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. We hope this was fruitful and interesting to you. Don't zoom out yet. In 10 minutes, we're resuming here with the next panel specifically on the Caucasus, peace negotiations, and the global energy transition. So bear with us, switch over to the next panel, and we'll be right back in a few minutes. Thank you so much.